Good morning for those from the United States, and bon dia for those from Europe, and good evening for those in Asia. Welcome to our event today. We will have a book forum on Gonçalo Santos' book, Chinese Village Life Today. My name is Jun Zhang, and I'm assistant professor at City University of Hong Kong, and I'm the chair and moderator tonight. Before we get into, let me explain and introduce our distinguished discussants and our authors briefly, even though none of them needs a detailed introduction. We will have three distinguished guest speakers to discuss the book. I'll introduce them very briefly and in alphabetical order. Professor Stephen Harrell is an ethnographer and interdisciplinary environmental researcher specializing in Taiwan, China, and the Pacific Northwest of North America. Professor Susan McKinnon is professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology, University of Virginia. Her work has focused on kinship, marriage, gender, hierarchy, and history of science and medicine. I'm Professor Ellen Oxfeld. Professor Oxfeld is a professor of anthropology at Middlebury College. She's an author. She has done extensive research in rural southeastern China. And I think some of you probably, just like me, got to know Professor Osfeld's work through her book on mahjiang in Mandarin. We have originally have the fourth discussant, Professor James Watson from Harvard University. Unfortunately, because of technical reasons, Professor Watson cannot join us today. And then we have Gonçalo Santos, our assistant professor now at University of Coimbra. He is an anthropologist and STS scholar. He has done extensive fieldwork in rural southern China, and also writes extensively on science and topics related to science technology. A little bit about myself. One more thing is Gonçalo is the founder and director of the international research network Sci-Tech Asia, which is the host for today's event. And I'm also a member of the Sci-Tech Asia network and one of the producers of the Sci-Tech Asia podcast series, Technoviews. I'm also an anthropologist, and my research is at the intersection of urban studies, development studies, and material culture. So that's our speakers today. And I'll briefly mention about the format for tonight. After this introduction, each of our speaker, three discussants, will have roughly 10 to 12 minutes to comment on one or a few aspects of Gonçalo's book. And afterwards, so you can see the screen, the book, Chinese Village Life Today, published by University of Washington Press in 2021. Afterwards, we will have roughly 25 minutes for discussions between the five of us, our three discussants, Gonçalo and me. We will try to encourage a more engaging conversation, more dynamics, rather than letting one person dominates the whole conversations. For the audience, during that period, anytime, please, you can start to use the chat box to leave your comments or questions. After that, the small group discussions, we will open for Q&A. And at that period, we will address some of the issues or questions and comments in the chat box, but you are also free to use to speak in person, just use the microphone. So in order to do so, please use the raise hand function. There's a symbol, just raise hand so that we know you have questions and you want to join the conversation. And if you choose to speak up, please turn on your camera when you speak and give yourself a brief introduction so that we know who we are having conversation with. So without further ado, and let me introduce let me welcome our first discussant for tonight. And we have Ellen, please.
Great, well, thank you. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Is it? Yeah, great. Okay, it's great to be here. And I see many people whose work I also really admire. So that I'm looking forward to all your comments in the discussion. I'm going to speak about two aspects of this really wonderful book. One is, and I'll start with the first, which is, one of the things that is really fantastic about this book is that it shows the strength of long-term field work. This author, Professor Santos, has conducted research in this one village and then with migrants from this village for over 20 years. And we really get, what is called thick description, right? And that's the hallmark of some of the best ethnography. He uses the metaphor of the hedgehog and the fox, and I think he's saying he's the hedgehog digging deep, and the results really show. Because what you get here is not just a snapshot in time, but it draws on his deep familiarity and association with the residents of Harmony Cave and also those residents who have gone off to Guangzhou to work. And you get things that you really can't get when you kind of dip in and, run in and run out, right? You get a sense of family strategies and intimate decisions. Over time, it's not the kind of thing that you can necessarily learn, even when you spend, a year, and you get a sense also of moral disagreements, a lack of moral unity. It's the kind of thing that I think demands some trust from people. And another thing I like in particular, I think especially at a time when we often, from the outside, we often see China as, from the top down, right? Commentators often talk about what's happening in terms of the people on the top or the decisions being made from the top. But here you really get a ground up view. And, Gonçalo did what we tell all our students in anthropology to do. He lived with people, he harvested and threshed rice with them, he hang out with people, he gambled with them, he gossiped, he would spend time with people as they washed their clothes, he took part in life cycle and calendrical rituals. But, he also communicated with people over WeChat and did, sort of took part in new modes of communication. So he reconstructed genealogies, which I really loved, your work on the genealogy. So the first point I just like to make, and it's not one that we always get a chance. I mean, that it's not always possible to have a 20-year relationship with a group of people. But when somebody does, that makes the outcome really special. And that's something I really appreciated reading through this. The second aspect of this book that I want to speak about is one that I've used a lot. I found his framework very useful. And in fact, I've recommended the book to many other people. And that is what is called the translocal model of rural livelihood and the pinpointing of the deterritorialized village identities. I think there's a notion often in looking at China, from top down or from the big picture of, well, there's rural versus urban, right? And China's urbanizing and rural sort of, disappearing or something. But that's really not quite what's happening at all. And I've really liked this notion of a translocal focus. I think it resonates a lot more with real life. We've seen the rapid urbanization of China, no doubt, but that has not eliminated the ongoing connection between urban and rural life. And we often don't get that sense of the new forms of rural connectedness in certainly not popular writing, and even sometimes ethnographic writing doesn't give us a really good sense of that. Rural migrants also to urban areas span a gamut of people. It's people engaged in white collar employment, people who are peasant workers or small business people. The particular people that are focused on here are people who have gone to the outskirts of Guangzhou, but they're engaged in farming for the market, right? In vegetable farming. That's a different category of people. And a lot of the people who are moving from rural areas to urban areas, they're moving back and forth. And they're also not just moving to mega cities. They may be, but they're also often moving back and forth between their homes and, smaller cities or county capitals. We hear a lot about the household registration system, and we know that that's, people also go back to access their social benefits because they can't always access that in the urban areas. So a couple of quotes here that I think have certainly been very useful for me. One is the notion of this trans-local model of rural livelihood. It's a much more accurate framework, I think, for thinking about rural to urban. Labor migration to cities can often reinforce ties to rural homes. It's not that you go and then you cut off your ties. It might make you want to strengthen what you have. You have to decide things like, what kind of house am I going to build in my village, even if I'm not going to reside there for much of the year? What kind of house do I build? Where do I build the house? People come back also for weddings, funerals, New Year's, all of these things. One other nice quote that I like is, the village remains a core site for the ritual celebration of shared identity. Villagers return to their rural homes to attend major communal events, and the village remains also a space of collective memory and a site for collective ritual activities. So even as people leave, they create meaning, very often return to the place, the village, as a place where they create meaning. Also, this other notion that when people are away from the village, they don't lose their sociality or social ties based on the village. Another nice way of framing this is the deterritorialization of village sociality. So the village as a place and a set of social connections begins to exist in many other spaces, not just the village space. And I think that's an important insight. I've used this a lot for my own research. I've worked in a Hakka area of Guangdong in Xian province. And most recently, it was before the pandemic, but in 2019, went back for the Lunar New Year to engage with people as they all returned for all the celebrations of the Lunar New Year. I've also been back at other times when people returned for the Mid-Autumn Festival. These are all times of travel in China, when people get en masse, travel back to their villages, whether it's for ancestral worship, sharing meals, reconnecting with their old homes, or Lao Jazz as it's called. And the return home reinscribes village identity for villagers who may be deterritorialized, but are not disconnected. Also, people's economic ties are complex, as we see in this ethnography. Often it's a decision of who stays back and who leaves, and it's sort of an economic balancing act of who remains. And another important point, that is something I found, but I think it's also something that we see in this ethnography, is we see cyber connectivity. That's very important, but cyber connectivity does not substitute for physical connection, right? So people use, it's important. I think it's an important area of research, social media and how people use that to stay connected for much of the year when they may not be at home in the village, but it's not a substitute for physical return. Now, having said all that, I think another important point here is that this does not mean any kind of emphasis on nostalgic, replication of the past. We see, and I know some of the other speakers will speak more about this, but we see all kinds of new forms or transformed forms emerging when people return to their place, even if it's a site of collective memory, a site of being re-embedded through ritual and the like. That doesn't mean what people are doing is replicating something from the past. And I'll quote Woody Watson, since he couldn't be here, I'll just channel him for a moment because it's a very nice quote. He wrote about diasporic members of the Man lineage who returned to Hong Kong for lineage rituals there. And one of the things his very long-term research looking at 40 years ago and then about 10 years ago. And one of the things he noted is when people return for those rituals, the rituals are no longer understood at all the way they used to be understood. They were understood as, all male lineage, male dominant, as he says, the Man lineage as a male dominated patrilineal, patrilocal institution no longer exists. That centuries-old kinship group has been replaced by an amorphously defined transnational clan, defined by a shared surname and voluntary participation. Now, that's not exactly what happens in Professor Santos's work, but the point being that when people return, what they're returning to can be changed. In the case of Professor Watson, members of the Man lineage are returning, and now they see these lineage rituals more as a celebration of their identity than of their particular space in the lineage hierarchy. As Professor Watson says, quote, ritual systems like their performers are embedded in history. As such, they are constantly changing. So I think also, and the emphasis on technology, decisions, and I won't get into it. I know Professor McKinnon will talk about this, but decisions about reproduction, all of that means that what people remember and celebrate is also changing as they come back. And when people come back, they also bring transformed notions. So I think my time may be almost up. So I will stop here.
Perfect.
And
Perfect
pass
timing.
the baton. Okay, good. I just let's checking the time, didn't want to run over. I will pass the baton to, I think, Professor Harrell.
Yes.
Thank you, Ellen. And I want to build on some things that you said and also to bring up some different things and maybe some things that will lead into what Professor McKinnon, I think, is going to talk about as well. I started out thinking about what I call the Shanghai syndrome. And this is not starving in order to not to get COVID. That's a temporary Shanghai syndrome. But the fact that disciplines dealing with China all seem to be confined to Beijing if they are political scientists and Shanghai if they're anything else. And we forget that there are more people, even permanently resident in rural China, not counting migrants, than there are in the entire European Union plus Ukraine. So rural China is a going thing. And I think we need to be reminded of that. And I think we need to be thinking about the roots of ethnographic fieldwork, which are almost all rural, although most ethnographic fieldwork that's being done in China now is being done in large cities, if not Shanghai, then Guangzhou or Dongguan or Chengdu or Xi'an or Jinan or wherever. And one very strong point and reason why people should be reading Professor Santos's book is because there are 600 million more or less, or maybe permanently resident people, plus another 200 or 250 million people going back and forth at any time. But, you know, that's not enough. The question is, what does this tell us about the larger scale? How do we connect the micro scale of everyday life in what is, after all, a small community that very few people, other people visit, with the macro life, which Professor Oxfeld has laid out so nicely, people participate in by permanent or temporary moving back and forth, not just of people, but of goods and also of electrons in the social media. So if we think about this book as a reminder that China remains a system as a whole, rather than a series of discrete parts. And I think that one of the ways to think about this is to think about material flows. And of course, there are two chapters in the book, which I think are probably unique. I don't think any other book on China has a chapter on flush toilets. I could be wrong. And there are books about China that deal with childbirth and various manifestations of childbirth, goes way back. But still, it's really rather unusual to look at it from this kind of standpoint of dissemination of technologies. So if we think about this, think about the flows of things, we think about flush toilets. What's significant about this? Well, one thing that's of course is very significant is that they become a kind of sign of modernity. And this has happened in a lot of different ways. I remember I was leading a tour of middle school children, American middle school children, to China in 1985. And we were taken to visit a model commune outside Wuxi. And we were put up in row houses that were supposedly peasant houses, and each room there had a flush toilet. Well, of course, it didn't flush. They were put there for the benefit of American tourists, many of whom all went to this same model commune. And partly it's a practical thing. You know, most Americans can't squat, can't do it. They don't have the muscles in their legs to do it. But at the same time, this was the idea that, oh, well, this is a Chinese commune. And they still have, you know, and they have modern things like fresh toilets and electric lights and so forth. I don't know what they did. I guess you used the toilet, and then after the tourists, they were only there one night, they, you know, emptied it out and did something with the contents. But this is a symbol of modernity. This is a symbol of material progress. But at the same time, and Gonçalo points this out in the book, this is all what Mindy Schneider in the recent works on China has talked about, the part of a metabolic rift, in that the reason that you didn't have flush toilets before, you know, in addition to the fact that there's, you know, the technology wasn't available, it was expensive, was that manure is the world's best fertilizer. And I remember living in rural Sichuan in 1994, and the toilet was in the pig pen. There was a wall about maybe 40 centimeters high between where the pigs did their thing and where the humans did their thing, and it all went into the same pit. And then it got mixed with straw and residue from rice cultivation, and it's called a Nongjia Fei, peasant household or a farm household fertilizer, and it went on the fields. Well, if you look at China now, people don't use manure as a fertilizer, or they use very little manure as a fertilizer. There's still some. But it's possible to install flush toilets someplace because they don't need the shit for something else. And it's not only a sign of modernity, but modernity becomes a breach in this ecosystem, which gets called a circular economy. But it's a circular economy in this case, not of renminbi, but of nitrogen and phosphorus, which of course produces the food. And so there develops a rift, and all of a sudden sewage becomes a thing. Now in cities, of course, that's cities everywhere, because people don't grow enough vegetables in their little gardens on their roof in order to use all the manure from the toilets or the dogs or whatever they have it from. But for rural areas, this is really a striking thing, because it kind of breaks that cycle. But then at the same time, the cycle gets stronger, and the connection between the rural area, between a city and its surrounding rural areas, in fact, gets stronger. It gets stronger because people are migrating. They're going back and forth. They're going for education. They're going for migrant labor. They're going to take bureaucratic jobs, and they're coming back and forth. But they're talking every day. And if you're a mother-in-law and you have the child at home, because the mother and father are in the city working, they're still talking to them every day. You know, whether you're doing a WeChat, video conference, the parents get to see their children on the screen, even if they don't see them in practice. So there are ways in which the rural and the urban and the sort of the whole circularity of social ecological systems gets broken in one material way, but then it gets reinforced or strengthened through other kinds of connections. And so maybe we should look at the process of change. And of course, as Ellen pointed out, you have to do field work someplace for 20 years to see these kind of processes of change. And those of us who've been going to China since the 1980s can't believe it, how different things are. But at the same time, there are these connections. And the other connection, and I hope this leads into what Susan McKinnon will talk about in a minute, is the reproductive connection. In order to understand this, you do have to go back to the past, and you do have to do genealogies. I'm of the generation of ethnographers that's old enough that we had to learn kinship. It was part of our curriculum, and it was not taught in the department where I was after 1990. But it was the core of anthropology from Lewis Henry Morgan in the 1860s to really up through the 1970s and 1980s. Well, that chain got broken. That chain of the study of kinship got broken, but it still is important in collecting genealogies. And I still have genealogies all over my computer. I probably won't use them, but I consider this to be a salient fact, and as Gonçalo has pointed out, it is actually a fact. But of course, reproduction is changing. And as Gonçalo and I pointed out in another book that we edited together, patrilineal itself is changing, and in fact is weakening in some ways, simply because people aren't having as many children. Now, of course, Harmony Cay was one of the most fertile places in China up into the 1990s. It was a kind of an exception that people were still having 3 and 4 children after the so-called one-child policy had been in practice for 12 or 13 years. So in this sense, it's kind of a bit of an exception, but it's getting to be a lower fertility place, and this is affecting the way in which people are more like urbanites. So the last thing I will say about this is that urban people and rural people are more alike than they ever have been before. At the same, and one of the reasons is that the rural community persists, but it persists in this interconnected system, which is more connected than ever in terms of communication. So anyway, these are just a few things about this book and the way that it helps us to think about social change and the rural and the fact that China changes so fast, even though some things don't change. Thank you.
Perfect. Susan.
Yes. Thank you for bringing me in on this conversation. And as I say, as I'm here, I think as a kinship specialist, I'm not a China specialist, so I beg your forgiveness if I am ignorant about things that everybody takes for granted. But here's my thoughts on this book, which I enjoyed very much. I really liked the analytic tension that you maintain between the top-down macro technocratic level of state power and governance and the bottom-up micro level of intimate choices and socio-technical ensembles. And I think that worked really brilliantly to reveal the complexities of how cultural values and processes are negotiated, unfold, and have transformed over time. So there's lots of things that to think about in all this, but I'm going to go with two queries. The first one relates to bring up genealogies. The first thing that relates to the larger structures and processes of what I'll call patrilineal generativity, understanding that what that means has changed. But the larger structures and processes of patrilineal generativity and kinship flourishing, and the kinds of socio-technical ensembles that support that flourishing. And in particular, I'm wondering whether one important aspect of those ensembles is absent from your account on the whole. So, Gonçalo, you beautifully describe a larger kinship structure that's both genealogical and spatial. And it stretches from founding ancestors and a core ancestral village, which marks the origin of life for this particular extended patriline. Out of this origin point, there's a genealogical unfolding, a flow of life of significant historical depth. I mean, it seems significant for a rural population rather than a dynastic population. But that unfolding traces a proliferation of multiple lineal branches, and that radiates out in space to the village peripheries, to the modern mansions with flush toilets, and further to the vegetable farms on the edges of big cities. And this proliferation has unfolded and branched out under an explicit ideology of reproductive competition between senior and junior patrilines, and that is tracked by generational markers that people pay attention to. And which has also been supported by various socio-technical ensembles, which you so nicely and beautifully describe, that foster fertility and the health of people and crops. And you detail some of these and how they've changed over time. For instance, the wonderful accounts of traditional, now seen as backward midwifery, as they have now transformed into newer, more modern scientific technical birthing procedures in hospitals. Or as we just talked about, the recycling of human waste on crops, which is now transformed into flush toilets, but also the use of chemical fertilizers. But in all of this modernization and economic development, there remains, as we've talked about already, a strong attachment to the ancestral village, which you say in chapter 1 is the site of collective memory and ritual. But you don't really tell us what that ritual is about, whether it's connected with births and marriages and deaths or what. Later in chapter 6, you talk about the local deity temples and popular religion, and you talk about these in terms of technologies of ethical imagination that build a shared identity and set of values. And mostly these have to do, as you describe them, with how to live a good life, how to achieve economic success, how to be generous and a patron of good living. But they are also concerned with what you say is seeking divine redemption from moral wrongdoing and ensuring divine protection. But you don't tell us what the consequences are of moral wrongdoing for kinship groups, or what people are seeking protection for or help for, or how any of this ritual effort really ties back to issues of patrilineal generativity and kinship flourishing. So I'm wondering whether the strong attachment to and a return to ancestral villages and the ritual practices involved with possibly ancestors, you don't talk about this, but also with local deities, whether these are or should be thought of as part of the socio-technical ensembles that rural people feel are necessary for the fertility, health, and flourishing of humans, of pastoralines, and of agricultural crops. I think of this partly because this movement out and back to ancestral places of origin is very common. You see it in Indonesian villages where I worked. You see it in Native American settlements where people who have moved out to places and lives that are completely entangled with what might be called the structures of modern life and livelihood, return to ancestral villages, back to origin places of the flow of life, to connect to the powers, which I think of as ancestors and local deities, that control life and death, that control health and fertility. I guess I'm surprised that you didn't include ancestors and local deities and the ritual life in ancestral villages as part of the socio-technical ensembles necessary to support the explicit competitive project of ensuring patrilineal generativity and flourishing, and in the various other aspects you talk about in terms of birthing and just all the kinds of things that, I mean, I would imagine in birth, marriage, and death rituals, this is very central. And all of this is central to sort of making kinship work. So that's one question. The other question I have is related to the way the state both accommodates and handicaps and extracts value from the rural population. On the one hand, the state made accommodations to patrilineal and agricultural values of the rural population during the one-child policy when it was more lenient about families having more children in the rural areas. It also supported the rural population with the development of chemical fertilizers to enhance crop yields, and the development of hospitals and more scientific healthcare and birth planning and procedures. And although you mention it, you don't really unpack what the state means by their support for traditional familism, I can't say this word, familism, or traditional family values as part of its socialist civilization project. So on the one hand, it's accommodating certain rural values, kinship values. On the other hand, the state seems to have handicapped the rural population in certain ways. Particularly, you mentioned the two-tier urban rural division in relation to state benefits, so that rural folks have limited access to social welfare and educational resources. And again, this may be completely self-evident to everyone who works in China, but that two-tier division came as a surprise to me. And you don't really quite talk about why it exists or what the rationale for it is, but it puts rural couples in a double bind. Women may have job equality, but no childcare. And so families are forced to either leave their children behind with grandparents or outsource childcare to professionals, which they really can't afford. And then they're criticized for leaving children behind and pushed to do the job of intensive parenting and to take a larger role in children's education. So in the process, the state, I would also, it occurs to me that the state is really extracting a lot of kinship labor of the rural population in the larger project of modernization and economic development, to the extent that it does not offer social welfare and educational resources to the rural population. So ultimately, I think this is another instance where there's a kind of tension between micro and macro, between local values and state values and intentions, and between the values that embody patrilineal generativity and kinship flourishing on the one hand, and on the other, the values of the CCP, which you suggest are primarily concerned with subordinating the small self of individuals, families, and communities to the larger self of the CCP-led narrative of Chinese nation and civilization. But I would have liked to have known more about this two-tier system, what the rationale is, how the state benefits from it, and what the local population thinks about it. And more particularly, how despite the state's emphasis on traditional family values, its policies nevertheless contribute to the breakdown of patrilineal structures and values, to the shift in power and authority away from lineage elders, who are now seen as backward and uneducated and feudal, and towards younger conjugal couples and breadwinning, nurturing daughters-in-law. So there's a kind of complexity there that I would have liked to have seen unpacked a little bit, and that's probably mostly because I don't understand, I don't know the details about the Chinese system, but I would have liked to have known more. So I think that's probably enough for me. Am I good?
Yes. So now let's have a conversation. Gonçalo, you want to respond to choose whatever question you want to respond first?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much to all the discussants for their incredibly thought-provoking, insightful comments. Some of the issues mentioned, they had already, I had already thought about them for quite a long time. Others came to me as new ideas that I will have to think through a little bit more. I'm going to pick and choose a couple of issues that were raised. I would start first with this idea of, I think, raised by Alan and to some extent by Steve, connecting also to the question that Susan asked about the, the rural-urban division in China. I think one of the points that I want to make with the book is to say that, rural China is alive and kicking. And I'm saying this because we are constantly confronted in the news, international media, and to some extent also in Chinese state media, with news about the end of rural China. This has been going on largely since the 90s. The news headlines keep on popping up. They are recurrent. I think to some extent it's hard for anyone to imagine how could we live a life without rural areas, given that people are living in the now dominant large cities of China, and China has many of them are feeding themselves with food that is procured to a large extent in rural areas. So these rural areas that I'm talking about are, the base, so to speak, on which the vibrant urban life that has flourished and mushroomed in China in the last 3 to 4 decades. And I think that we haven't really paid that much attention to it. And, one reason, Susan, is given the politics of value, of spatial value of the last few decades, there has been a kind of invisibilization of rural areas. Obviously, the core of China's modernization drive and its ascent to superpower status in the 21st century, has emphasized, has put all the the city at the top of the value creating chain, and in the process, it's hard to imagine, or it has become hard to imagine, how can anyone want to live in rural areas. So because what we have to talk about is the exodus, right? So in this book, I'm trying to counter a little bit this trend of thinking about rural urban as a either or as a shrinking equation. What I'm talking about, perhaps drawing on a long line of writers, one that comes to mind is Raymond Williams' beautiful book, The Country and the City, in which he looks at shifting images of the country and the city in England since the 16th century. And I think that we have to think about the urban and the rural as in light of those shifting set of relationships that are modeled not just by the activities of people themselves, their movements in space, their social and cultural constructions, but also by the creations of artists, of writers, and so on and so forth, that set models of and for how things should be thought of. So, in this model, we're very far away from the beginnings, really, of the anthropology of China, which talked about an earthbound China, right? I mean, Fei Xiaotong, the famous Chinese anthropologist, talked about an earthbound China, a China that cannot escape this overarching attachment to land, to territory, and to lineage as well, because territory and lineage overlap. This new rural China that I'm talking about, from this more relational perspective, is one in which, of course, we cannot be confined to a specific space, because people themselves are moving in space. People themselves that are moving in space, as Ellen mentioned, between the, if I have to choose between the hedgehog and the fox, I would say that my methodology clearly stands along the side of the hedgehog. But hedgehogs also have mobile phones, and they can hop on trains, and they can hop on airplanes, because people themselves are doing that. And as an anthropologist, you have to go with the flow. And you realize as you do that, the space that people inhabited, is actually challenging clear-cut distinctions between rural and urban. I mean, surely there is a rural perspective in the sense that, these people have come from one place. These people have ancestors. These people hold on to rituals of patrilineal generativity, as Susan was talking about, of various kinds, from rituals in tombs in honor of their ancestors, to lineage anniversaries, to celebrations of, the births of male heirs. I remember one of the questions that we were always asking New Year is, how many rockets are we firing today? Even today, people are asking this. And by rockets, what they mean is, how many male heirs have we produced this year? Meaning people that can be added on to the lineage, because those are the only ones that are going to get generational markers, the generational markers that Susan was talking about. And so, these rituals put us, oblige us to look at these shifting rural-urban relations from a particular perspective. It's no longer the perspective of the Shanghai syndrome that Steve was talking about. Of course, Shanghai is important, Guangzhou is important, Beijing is important. This is not an either-or question, once again, because we have to look at China as a system, to use Steve's perspective, Steve's term, system in the sense of, there are relations between different sets of terms, rural, urban, inland, coastal, and so on and so forth. You know, looking at things but you can look at these relations from a very particular perspective that obliges you to bring in the kind of knowledge that we acquire through anthropological fieldwork, the kind of anthropological fieldwork that Alan was talking about. One of the things that I would like to, I don't know if I still have much time, June, to talk, but I would like to.
Yes, you have talked quite a long time, so try.
So shall I stop and we start the conversation?
Yes, if anyone want to chime in and join, please feel free anytime. Don't let Gonçalo dominate the conversation. And also, before we move on, just a quick announcement for all the audience. Please feel free use the chat box to leave your comments or questions. We may also, even during the small group discussions, we may actually also pick up some of your comments and address some of them. So please do so. Yeah, anyone want to?
Well, I would just like to add something very quickly, which is that, you know, I'd like to qualify, you know, a term that it's actually in the book, the age of transition, because so Chinese village life today, building families in an age of transition, because I think that understanding what do I mean by transition in that, by the transition term in that subtitle, perhaps will help the audience understand a little bit better what can flush toilets, you know, translocal movements in space using smartphones, you know, usage of new childbirth technologies have to do with one another. Why put them all in a single book? You know, I was kind of thinking as I was writing the book, you know, how to characterize the, if we were to use the term transition, of the last, you know, that occurred in China since its opening to the global capitalist system in, you know, the late 1970s, you know, 1980s. And of course, one term that has largely dominated China's studies in the last decades is to refer to it as a post-socialist transition of sorts. I mean, China was a communist country, high socialism dominated, you know, political economy. As China opens to the outside world, of course, that a number of reforms happen, and you know, China will have to deal with the fact that it has become increasingly, you know, encountering increasingly international trends of governance, and also, you know, the way that capitalism works. I sort of propose in this book an alternative way of looking at the last few decades. And if I were to choose the term, I would refer to it as a technocratic transition. It's not to say that experts and science was not important in Chinese political life before the 1980s. But I do think that the role of, you know, in the last 4 to 5 decades in China, not just in China, but in many other parts of the world, what we've seen is sort of a, you know, the rise of a model of governance in which, you know, we have an increasing capacity to put in place far-reaching technocratic interventions shaping the conduct of everyday life. And it's no wonder then when I first arrived in Harmony Cave, you know, people were afraid about, you know, unclear about my identity. You know, they thought that I was, you know, some thought that I was a spy working for the Chinese government as I could speak Cantonese, you know, checking them out on the family planning policy, how many kids they were having. At some point, the government implemented, you know, a ban on coffin burials. So I must be working for the Chinese government to check them out on how, whether they are following the policies and so on and so forth. And this incident, or this perception of the foreigner, you know, what it suggested to me is what I came to experience over the last 2 decades, is that village life, or, you know, in all its various dimensions of everyday life, from population movements to family planning, to childbirth, to child rearing as well, or things like personal hygiene and the way houses are built and sanitation is conceived, or even the most intimate village life, popular religion rituals. all of these various dimensions of everyday life were subject to far-reaching technocratic interventions, that completely reconfigured the way that people were living. And so my challenge is, how can we understand these transformations, not just, as it's usually the case, from the point of view of the people who are implementing these policies or implementing this, civilizing missions, or, civilizing, ideals, right? Which include not just government officials, but also various kinds of non-governmental organizations and so on and so forth. How can we look at these transformations from the perspective of specific village communities? Will this change the way we perceive what is happening?
Cut short, one sentence. You have been speaking for almost 15 minutes.
Are ancestors and local deities dwindling, disappearing altogether, and being replaced by this new secular technocratic culture? Or do they continue to be mobilized to make sense of what's going on?
Yeah.
So these are some of the issues that I'm trying to raise in the book. So I don't know if, so I talked a little bit for too long, right, June?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Any response? Let me chime in a little bit for, I think there is always a tension for anthropologists to write ethnography, in-depth, long-term field work, give you a very in-depth understanding, trying to connect our bottom, how everyday life is, and then connect to a larger trend. This is a question actually you gave me just several days ago when you talk about my book, I Rise on Guangzhou, and you said, I need to do some more ordinary city writing, not what Steve just mentioned, the Shanghai symptom, just a few big cities as a representative of China, urban China. What about the same question for you? What is the unique thing about, what is the uniqueness of a village in that part of China? Again, rural life in China can be quite diverse. A village in Northwest China will be very different from a village in South China. So just like the question you raised for me, the same question for you. What can we learn from this specific village? And since your book is called Village Life, without talking about which part of China, so I don't know whether it's relevant for you or just a question.
Yeah, I think there are some general features in the book that are common to much of rural China, and some parts of aspects of the book that are more specific to South China, rural life in South China. But in a way, the most regional, or the regional specificities are good to think about, important issues of issues of temporality, for example. Susan has mentioned the generational markers, and Ellen has mentioned the issue of long-term fieldwork. One of the good things about long-term fieldwork is that it does force you to take in the perspective of the people that you're working with. Not only the people that you're working with, but you increasingly realize that these people are tied to previous generations of ancestors that go well beyond the level of the grandfather up to the great grandfather and so on. And suddenly you're starting to realize, by paying attention to things like community rituals, that the community that you're dealing with seems to be operating at two different temporalities. There's the temporality as recorded in generational markers, and that take us back to the founding ancestor of the village, several centuries earlier. And that is the kind of village life in slow motion, right? So that's village life in slow motion. It's slowly coming into being, and it's a kind of speed that requires the slow science that anthropologists are so famous for. You know, the kind of science that requires long-term fieldwork, right? But then there's also village life in the fast lane, right? And that village life in the fast lane has taken on an increasingly higher speed as infrastructures of mobility and transportation have emerged over the last few decades, and engagements with urban lifestyles and so on have also intensified in many ways. I think rural China is a wonderful place for us to get hold of this, of a sense of a more sort of solid understanding of the relationship between these two kinds of temporalities. The fast temporality is the one that helps us understand why newspaper headlines talk about the end of village China, right? Because, you know, life now is so fast. You know, life now is so fast that, you know, surely once in the city, nobody wants to go back, right? But the slow temporality of the generational markers that Susan was mentioning in her intervention, it's the kind of temporality that reminds us that someone is playing with a flying kite, you know, and that there's a string, and that people may be moving like a flying kite in the sky, and moving around for reasons of, you know, livelihood, sometimes for play, sometimes for entertainment, sometimes for adventure, right? But at the same time, it's hard to cut that string, the tie back home. It's something or various forces keep on compelling us to return, be it because somehow we do not find satisfaction in urban spaces. It's not our space. Susan, please.
I think, I mean, I'm taking this from a kind of Indonesian perspective, but I think of that tension between the two different times, but it's also a kind, I think of it as a kind of anchoring of that movement out and back. And it's an anchoring, well, I guess it's my question to you really, is it an anchoring because that is and remains the source of powers over life and death, the ancestors and local deities, you know, in the midst of all these technical changes, is there still, I don't know whether this is the case or not, but what are all these rituals for, if not to anchor people back to sources of life and fertility and health and well-being, and if you break that connection somehow, you know, there's a threat to that kind of kinship flourishing. So anyhow, I like to think of it as a kind of anchoring, an anchoring at the source of life, of where life comes, you know, flows out of those, you know, those points of deep time and ancestral space, that continues to be relevant even in the midst of these sort of technological changes. It's more of a question than a statement, but.
Susan, I think the answer to your question really is twofold. I mean, there's the political economy answer, which goes in the direction of, you know, the question that you were asking about rural-urban distinctions. You know, the government keeps in place a number of, you know, distinctions between a population that is registered as agricultural and population that is registered as non-agricultural, right? So rural and urban. And these distinctions have serious implications about access to various kinds of, social welfare benefits, services, schooling, healthcare even, and so on and so forth, which of course mean that although it is possible now, unlike, in the height of the high socialist period, for rural folks to move to the city, right? Their encounter with the city is obviously molded or shaped by, profound inequalities built into this two-tiered population distinction, right? This is, of course, very convenient for the government because it's the best way to keep on having cheap labor force coming from rural areas without having to handle the nightmare of, dealing with a massive growth of permanent population in the cities, right? And without having to deal with the costs also of raising that population. So this is a very convenient solution, right? And I think the other answer, more from the lies in the side of meaning and the side of affect as well, and the sense that this is something that always struck me as that I remember in the beginning as I started to do field in rural areas, being always struck by how I never really encountered much sense of dissatisfaction with many of the things in linked to rural lifeways with the people that I was working. And on the other hand, the kind of assumptions, especially in migration studies, that people want to leave the countryside and to never return. I mean, quite the contrast. Yes, the city was an interesting place to go to work, but it was also a place that was attached to difficulties, to struggles, to a way of life that lacked the support of being a member of of having a hometown, right? Of our hometown, where we have our social support network. I mean, that was missing. It's excitement minus the social support network. It's excitement minus the fun things that we used to do when we were kids in the countryside, and all the nice food that we normally eat. So that's not very exciting, right? So the city is a place of sacrifice, indeed. I mean, it's a place where you have to have a frugal life to save, to then spend on lavish rituals back home. That's where you construct meaning. Is that meaning enough for you? I mean, I would say that I would say that it will depend on the answer to that question will have different will differ depending on the person. But of course, I mean, to many migrants in the city, it's a life in suspension. I mean, it's waiting for the real action to happen. And seeing decades of their lives flying by without having without having a sort of a fully enjoying all the things they've built back home. And perhaps when they return, feeling that they're no longer, they miss it, they have the nostalgia, but at the same time it no longer feels the right way. So it's this kind of in between kind of situation. The rituals remain extremely meaningful, without any doubt, and powerful. And I don't think it's just an aesthetic.
Gonçalo, sorry, I have to cut you off. We have to, the time's up for a small group discussion. Let's open the floor for Q&A. We have one comments and questions from the audience. Miriam, would you like to actually introduce yourself and ask a question?
course. Thank you very much for the forum. It's very stimulating. And I look forward to reading your book. I was wondering how your kind of approach to fieldwork and fieldwork practices change over time as you change as a person and as an ethnographer. For instance, how you relate to people or how you choose your topic or location, your focus to focus on. I was wondering if you could reflect on these changes.
Definitely lots of changes. It's hard to, I'm gonna mention just a couple of them. I think it was very important for me in the beginning to kind of have, have a more sort of grounded experience in the township, the rural township where I was based, and specifically in the village that I was working, and the hamlet that I was leaving. I remember the first 2 to 3 stints of fieldwork, including the first that I spent there some 14 months. I spent a lot of time doing agricultural work. Really a lot of time doing agricultural work. I remember, cultivating, I think somebody mentioned rice. I cultivated taro. I cultivated cassava. If I wasn't doing some kind of agricultural work, I was doing the kind of marketing activities connected to agricultural work. So I would be following villagers to local markets. So it was a key moment for me as someone coming from largely urban areas before in Europe, where I kind of expanded my sort of empirical knowledge of what it is to live in the countryside, what kinds of animals I'm going to encounter, what kinds of plants, how do we handle them, how do we travel in the rice fields without falling into the water, and without being constantly looking to the rice tracts in order to not fall. How do we? It was also very formative in terms of language skills. By the time I arrived in Harmony Cave, I was already speaking Cantonese, learned in Macau and Guangzhou, but local Cantonese is significantly different from a standard Cantonese, not just because of the pronunciation, but also because of the kinds of things that people say, because it's metaphors are very rural. People in the city are not necessarily familiar with them, and so on and so forth. So I think what I remember from this preliminary period of fieldwork was to kind of this hard work of making sense of the world I was in, and I think that through that process, I believe that I've earned the respect of many of the people with which I live, because they encountered in me someone having an attitude that, quite frankly, and I had the opportunity to witness it myself, they were not very familiar with. I was not looking at them. I was not looking down at them. I was actually asking them questions that, for the first time, probably they heard someone coming from the city asking them to learn things from them. It was not me teaching them things. It was me learning things from them. And it made me look very silly in the beginning. That was really hard to handle. And it also cast a lot of suspicion on my kind of, what kind of person I was. But I do believe that it made all the difference in terms of opening up, connections in the village and earning the trust of fellow villagers. And as I earned that trust, I started to move, you know, much more in space. I started to visit villagers in, you know, in the city much more often. I started to track the vegetable gardens in Guangdong. Where are they located? How many are they living in huts in vegetable gardens or renting apartments? I started to have eventually the phone numbers of everyone, okay, because as people started also to move to mobile phones, so I started to use mobile phones to communicate with people. I started to be able to organize individualized interviews as well as focus group interviews with people via telephone, via, yeah, I think the telephone quickly too. Oh, there was a period in which I was using letters and I was writing letters and I was receiving letters, but that lasted for a very short period. The phone really took over a significant part of the way that my methodological net was set. And I was able to start focusing on more specific questions and also develop a more minute understanding of differences between villages and disagreements as well. I also started to get much more often gossip about you know, fights in different families. Yeah, I think there was a, you know, I moved to, yeah, it's as if your attention gets, you know, the focus of your attention shifts over time as you are learning different things and as you are entering different layers of intimacy or proximity with people. I don't know if this answers your question.
Other questions, comments? Ellen, please.
I just want to wait and see if, because I knew Miriam had a question, if anyone else in the audience. I had a couple of thoughts, but I wanted to wait and see if anything else from the rest of the audience.
Yeah, I think you can go.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, I love what you said about, especially in our pandemic times, having, you know, some kind of ability through the phone, WeChat or whatever, to continue conversations, which might be important for us over space now, when it's harder to actually be in place. So that's really useful. One thing I did want to say, though, I was thinking that it's, I think, really important for us when we think of, you know, rural and urban and translocal, and thinking a little bit of Steve's comments too about fertilizer and the like, not to think of this as, you know, villagers versus urban, right? Or technocrats. And you bring this out very well, actually, that it's not that, right? Technocrats versus mass base, right? Because there are things that people heartily embrace that come, so to speak, from the technocratic top, and things not so embraced, right?
Yeah.
And also amongst people, there are many, as you point out, moral disagreements and not one thing set. Two particular things, sort of responding to Susan and Steve, that came to me. One was this whole idea of patrilineality and, you know, ancestral rituals and the like. And one thing I noticed was a lot of, when people come back for a ritual, they might not think it is about, you know, fertility or God's blessing, right? A lot of people think, well, I don't really think the ancestors really, you know, exist anymore, but this is the way I connect to my place. Or they may be, a lot of women are coming back who have a place, married women who've married out. They're not in the patriline, or, you know, their descendants won't be in the patriline, but there's a whole sets of rituals that celebrate the village, or even the ancestors, but it's not so patrilineal based, it's welcoming, for instance, the daughters of the lineage in, or people, affinal connections. And so now the sense is not the same sense. The ritual may look somewhat similar, but people are participating for a variety of reasons. So I think it's really important, and that's something you get from long-term field work is, again, people's framing of something may be quite different. And I was also thinking, Steve, just about this whole issue of fertilizer. And I actually asked people when I was working on food, like, what do you do? And, there's so many things that come to bear. People will say, well, I would never, ever put chemical fertilizer on my own vegetables, right? Or if it's my rice that I'm growing just for my family, I might use a little, but that, I'm really aware, like people would say, we know this isn't good for you, right? So, we'll try to use a little less, but then maybe on something people are growing for market, meant for other people, they want to increase the productivity. So they may say, well, it's easier to use, nongyao, the chemical fertilizer, because it's going to be more productive, and this is for sale, and I can't afford to be so picky. So even in a technological answer, like what do you use when you farm, there's going to be some variety. That's not to say that the trends aren't there, but how do people internalize things is sort of interesting, and there's often a lot of contradiction. It's not just resistance and hegemony, and it comes out in a lot more complex ways.
I wonder if I raise a danger that we might be overreacting. We're all talking about how, no, it's not the spectralization of the village and the emptying out of the countryside and donut villages and all this kind of thing. No, there's still a vibrancy and a living connection to the land on the parts of people. And there's still, I see this as, of course, this is a reaction to an earlier trend in China, in China studies. But I wonder if, and Gonçalo is doing long-term field work, the younger generation, do they know as much? Are they as attached? Or are we seeing the sort of the tail end of this, particularly since the agricultural policy now is to consolidate farms and to make, big American style farms with big tractors and all sorts of chemicals and large markets and 500 or 1,000 pigs in one place and so forth. I wonder if we aren't just sort of, in spite of ourselves, being nostalgic about, no, the village is still there, rural China is still there. I'm saying this to be deliberately provocative.
Matthew, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Steve's comments, something I was thinking about as well. I appreciate the reflections and I've heard thus far this morning here in California, this morning in California. But I do wonder how much this is drawn from, say, the people who are going back, or there are a lot of people who are in the cities, who've moved to the cities, who are not going back. How much are we talking to them about why they're not going back? I mean, how much of this is kind of the result of the sampling that we're doing of talking to people who are going back and who have kind reflections? I just got back from Cleveland, Ohio, where I was born, and I just went back for Passover Seder. I do that every single year, and I like to listen to Cleveland baseball radio. And I go back to Cleveland several times a year, actually, to see my father and to see some of my cousins, and it's very meaningful for me. But there are a lot of people who have left Cleveland who never go back. And I just think I would be, I would be one data point, but I think there's just a lot of people who might offer a different viewpoint on this. I'm just wondering how to better capture their voices in this. So that's one thought. Thank you. But thank you. I really, I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. And I look forward to reading the book and teaching it.
Gonçalo, you want to
Can I
respond?
say something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally see where Steve and Matthew's question are coming from. I mean, I really don't think it's an either or question, and perhaps we may come across as overemphasizing a little bit the village perspective side of things, because in the current economy of knowledge within China studies, I mean, that's the one that has been underrepresented. And I do think that you know, lots of migration studies have been talking about the kind of people that Matthew was mentioning earlier. I mean, the kinds of people that have left China, you know, their villages for various reasons, because they got rich, because they married somebody else, because they excelled at education and just managed to become another member of the you know, professional class in China, and probably don't want to go back. Or perhaps people who, for reasons of sexual orientation, and I know several, do not find a space and to live, or a space, or a sort of the kind of reception and tolerance that they are going to find in the more anonymous city, and who left resenting much of the period that they of their growing up period, right? And don't want to have anything to do with traditional rituals, even though they might have some kind of nostalgia from time to time about the times when they were growing up and playing with lizards in the lake. But that's just a memory. That's just a memory, and perhaps sometime they might want to think about dying and having their body transported back to their village. But you know, meanwhile, they've had their life in the city. So I think we've been planning. I think we've been getting plenty of stuff on this kind of. I mean, not all types, but certainly those that, you know, were sort of more successful and that managed to get out. There are also those that left because of being persona non grata. One of them, one of these types that comes to mind are the snitches, the birth planning policy snitches. I mean, there were a couple in my village, and they left because, you know, they became persona non grata, basically. You know, nobody liked them, you know, and they've done things that were just not acceptable by village standards. But at the same time, we do have these villages that we might want to look at them as remnants of something, which probably I would advise against, because, you know, it kind of makes us look at what's going on in rural China in the light of something that is no longer, or we look at, you know, what's going on in rural China today as, you know, a key part of the kinds of emotional and cultural frameworks that are sustaining the vibrant industrial economy of one of the world superpowers, you know, and that, you know, that we are not paying attention to those frameworks, to those, you know, emotional and cultural frameworks. It's because, you know, who wants to give a damn about who's doing the reproductive work, you know? Ellen.
I was just going to say, I mean, this is such a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could, we need another conversation at least to sort this all out. But one thing I think we don't want to lose sight of is, from the top down, there's a lot of sort of internal contradiction as well. We can't forget that one reason, you know, in the initial rural reform and opening up, right, that the idea of making sure villagers still had some rights in the land was partly the idea that if you go to the city and things are bad and you're laid off, you're going to go back home, right? Not make trouble as a laid off worker in the city, right? So take when the pandemic, when things, got sort of closed up. I mean, the idea that people can go back and have land is, yes, it's so people have rights in the land. Also, to get to Susan's point, maybe that's one reason people don't have all their social benefits in the city. But the other thing is that's the escape hatch that was, that China always thought about, because you look at Mumbai or you look at other big places where you get a working class in a downturn is laid off. What do? They gather together in the city and they, rise up or whatever. So it's a lot of internal contradictions there. On the one hand, it's so people do have food. They can go back and they can always have food. And on the other hand, it's an escape hatch so people don't hang around. So, that's a top-down, like, internal contradiction. And we talk about the nuance from bottom up, but there's also nuance from top down. And I think we need to keep that in mind.
Can I just ask a quick question? I mean, to the three of you, because you're in the States. I mean, in the States too, we've been talking about the end of the countryside for how many decades?
Right, exactly.
And the countryside keeps on popping up. In fact, one of the key factors, it seems to me, in sort of newspaper discussions, sociological discussions about cultural wars in the States today, post-Trump especially, it's this sort of rural-urban divide, isn't it? It's sort of whatever is going on, it has to be, this rural divide clearly is shaping different sort of voting
in Europe too,
right?
Europe too.
In Europe too as well. So I would say one of the arguments for not ignoring the countryside is perhaps to kind of, make sense of, these tensions that are emerging, not just in Europe, not just the United States, but also, I would say, in China.
I think, we have to bring in the role of agriculture again, because, about 1.5% of the US population are farmers. I think someplace like Germany is like 4%. And fewer and fewer people in Chinese villages are farmers, and there are the same amount of land and fewer farms, more and more mechanization, more and more chemical inputs. There's this wonderful book by a journalist called The Blockchain Chicken Farm, where you can, you use the blockchain to authenticate the organicity of the chicken that you're buying for, 40 kwai a gin or whatever it is at some fancy urban grocery store. So that the rural will obviously stay, but how much of this sort of community united by sense of place, sense of home, nostalgia, and kinship connections will it be? Or will it be something, that will, in 20 years from now, I won't be around, but in 20 years from now, will there be, a very different rural? I mean, you've only been there 25 years. There's another 25 years ahead, and there's another 25 years ahead of that. And so even though this is this fieldwork is informed by a temporal perspective of having experienced all these changes yourself, it stopped. It's the last time you're there is 2019, and 2039 it's going to be different. And so we simply have to realize that this is it's not a snapshot in time, but it's 一段时间. It's not some kind of a permanent transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think your word seems to be the perfect ending conclusion for our dialogue today. So time's up, and thank you very much. Thank you all for joining the conversations and your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.